So the fanfare would indicate it's Mr. Anderson here again with another podcast for GCSE Citizenship revision. And this is now for Theme 3, the Global Village. Although, of course, we will be chucking a few other ideas in as well. Now, I'm going to break this down into 3 parts, part of which is not on your revision sheet. And that's the first part, which is business and the economy. I'm then going to look at the environment and campaigning groups and issues on that. And finally, we're going to look at international organisations and where the UK, as our country, fits in with these throughout the entire world. So we'll begin with the economy and business. Now this is the big news story at the moment, and it has been really for the last year. If you don't get questions about this in your exam, frankly, I'll be rather surprised. It's well worth you knowing about it. Now I'm just going to take you through some of the main ideas now, which don't appear on your revision sheet. But let's face it, all you have to do is buy any newspaper, watch any TV news broadcast, or go to bbc.co.uk/news or sky.com/news, and you will find an awful lot of information about the economy and about the issues that we and many other countries in the world are currently facing. Now, the economy can be described as anything and everything that is produced or made or offered in a country in a single year. And they can be split down in several ways. We have the public sector and the private sector, and then we have goods and services. Let's take, for example, the public sector. Now, most of us access public sector services almost every day. Certainly those of us working in education do, because our school is funded by the government, and therefore that's a public service in the public sector, because it's paid for from taxation. Can you make a list of other public sector bodies or organisations that you use or that are available but you don't use? Why not pause and make a quick list? Now, having had 30 seconds to that, let's think about the private sector for a moment. What kind of things does the private sector do? Well, the private sector will offer us goods or products and services. So, for example, you only have to go down to any of our local shops and they are all in the private sector. Sometimes these are owned by individuals or families. Other times they're large companies owned by shareholders. And this is where a company is split down into thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of small parts, each available for the public or organisations or institutions to buy, and that's known as a share. So, for example, if you had £500 and a company was trading at £2 a share, you could buy 250 shares in that company. And then when the company made profit, you would get a dividend from that company, a payment for being part of an owner of that company. And the UK is one of the biggest private share-owning countries in Western Europe. Why not pause now for 30 seconds and make a quick list of some of the private businesses, services and products that you buy or use on a regular basis. Now, in the private sector, we expect there to be competition. So, for example, there isn't just one supermarket company. Even in our area, we have a choice of some big and some small ones. So, you can go to Morrison's or the Cooperative, or you can go a little bit further afield and go to Asda or Sainsbury's or Tesco or Summerfield. There's a huge amount of choice for people. But what's the purpose of competition? Well, if there was only one company providing these services, they would be able to charge whatever they wanted. But as there are several, it means that people have a choice of where they go. So to try and attract you, companies need to either offer good prices or better products, or why not a mixture of both. For example, if you wanted to get some really good quality food for a night, maybe you would go to Marks and Spencer's. If, however, you wanted to buy food and keep the price down, perhaps Asda would be a better place to go. On the other hand, it might be really convenient just to walk over the road or down the street and go to the local co-op or Summerfield to buy something conveniently. This is competition, and competition works in all sorts of different ways. But not all goods and services are available or suitable for competition. For example, some people suggest that you can't really have competition in education, perhaps, or certainly not in the armed forces and the police. That's why they are funded from the taxpayer, from you and I when we pay VAT on things that we buy, or adults when they pay income tax and national insurance on their earnings. We pay towards these services that we all need and use. And that's why the public sector exists, to provide services that the private sector can't, won't, or shouldn't provide. After all, would we really want private sector armies fighting over who fights the best and maybe causing problems that way? No country works like that because it really can't. Why not make a list now of a spidergram or something of some of the private and public sector services that are provided, and think about why they're provided by the private sector or the public sector and not the other. Now, moving on to another part about business and the economy, we'll hear a lot in recent months about inflation and interest rates, and these are two ideas that I'm just going to briefly explain to you. Inflation is really how much things cost and how much they increase or decrease in cost over a year. For example, generally over the last 15 years or so, the inflation rate in Britain has been between 2 and 5%, which means that a year from now, if the inflation rate is 5%, something that cost £1 will next year cost £1.05. What that means is that our wages have to go up as well, and pensions and things have to go up. Because if you don't have your wages go up by the rate of inflation, you end up being able to spend less, and that's a problem. But why do prices rise? Prices rise for a variety of reasons. Maybe there is greater demand for something, so people can put the prices up because people are willing to pay those prices. It could be that something is in short supply, and so therefore you have to pay more in order to get hold of it. There is also the risk of deflation. Now, deflation is something we are currently going through in the UK for the first time in something like 50 or 60 years. This is where prices fall, and I think our rate of deflation is something like 1.5% at the last measure. Now, you might think that prices falling is always a good thing, and of course it can be in many circumstances. On the other hand, inflation is an average figure, and so if some prices are falling a long way whilst others are going up, what that means is pay rises and pension rises might not increase either, but yet some of the costs that people pay, like on fuel, which are still going up, people have to pay. They can't get out of it. Whilst the prices of things people buy as an option, let's say things like chocolate or certain types of fruit and veg or computer equipment, not the kind of things you have to buy or buy all the time, they might be falling quite rapidly. But that means that the economy isn't being very soundly managed at the time, and that is a problem. So governments prefer to have a small amount of inflation. On the other hand, in Zimbabwe over the last few years, they had inflation which at one time rose to 3,500 million %, which meant that things were trebling in price every few hours. Now, of course, no economy can manage properly like that. The other economic rate I was telling you about was the interest rate, and the interest rate is the price of money. This tells us how much it costs for us to borrow money and how much it costs for others to lend it from us. Now, the interest rate is set by the Bank of England, and at the moment it's at its lowest rate. It's at 0.5%. It hasn't been so low, I think, ever in the UK. Now, this means that it's cheaper for people to borrow money. So if you were to borrow £500 and the interest rate was 10% every year, that would mean that until you paid it back, the amount you owed would go up by 10% every year. So at the end of the first year, you would owe £550, and the next year it would be another 10%, so it would be £605 on top of that. So the interest rate dictates how much it is to borrow. Now that matters, because not only do private individuals need to borrow, say a mortgage to buy a house or a loan to buy a car, but companies need to borrow as well. They need to borrow to invest, to create new jobs, to build a new factory, to invest in a new product that we might all need or buy, and so on. At the moment, the UK has deflation and very, very low interest rates, a combination that we've not had before, and so no one really knows precisely how it might work. Why not take this opportunity to go to the BBC News website or somewhere and look and see what people are saying about our economy at the moment. It would also be worth your while just to quickly revise and check up things such as the amount of debt that the government is having to get into and borrow in order to pay for public services. These things are very important, and we've touched on them in theme 2, but it does affect our economy as well. Well, that's the end of part 1 here on YouTube. Part 2 will look at globalisation and the environment.